Hi there, John Moore here, and I am a shamanic teacher and practitioner. I live in Maine in the US, up here in the Northeast. I'm looking out the window because it is currently snowing, and I love to see the snow. It's very beautiful. This time of year, we're approaching Yule. And today I want to talk just a little bit about Norse shamanism. And it's something I know a little bit about. I know a whole lot about shamanism and a little bit about Norse shamanism. And I want to talk about that. And one of the reasons I want to talk about that is there is a very wide misconception that shamanism belongs to one culture or one small set of cultures. And that's just not true. There were shamanic practices everywhere in the world. Yes, the word shamanism came into English through Russian, German, Dutch, and before that from Siberia. But the word, or the roots of the word, or cognates of the word, and all of those things exist all throughout, all throughout Asia anyway, and parts of the Middle East. There are, Aramaic has something very close to shamanism. So does Sanskrit, so does Pali, so does Chinese, the Tartar languages. So that word exists. Yes, it is a borrowed word in English, but it came in the 1600s, in the late 1600s. So it's been an English word for hundreds of years. But that being said, there's, a lot of people, when I try to talk about shamanism, will say, well, you can't do that because you're not Mongolian or Siberian or Native American or what have you. My ancestors primarily came from Western and Northern Europe, and they were shamanic people before Christianity came in. And Christianity came in with the Romans primarily, and came in at the point of a sword. And we know that they did things like destroyed druid groves, destroyed pagan temples. The mystery school at Eleusis, for example, had been in existence for over 1,000 years and was practicing, we might call it shamanism. They were using something called kaikon. Kaikon was a beer that had ergot in it, which is a fungus, which is toxic in high doses, and in low doses is basically the thing that we derive LSD from. So they were tripping there and meeting their gods, going on journeys for over 1,000 years, and that was wiped out when Roman Christianity came and took over. And sort of the same thing happened in the areas that we would consider Norse. Now, we associate Norse with Vikings, of course, and the Viking era was a period of time in Northern European when, Vikings, which Viking was a job. It wasn't a people. It wasn't a race or an ethnicity or even a nationality. When they've dug up Viking graves, and they know because of the grave goods and where they're located and whatnot, it was a job description. They were basically like, pirates, raiders, but also traders. They were sailors, and they went all over. They went from, Eastern Europe all the way, now we know, to at least Canada. Right, there's a Viking longhouse that's been in Lansau Meadows that has now been dated, very precisely dated, and we think that we know who was there and when and how long it lasted and all of that, because we can do carbon dating and dendrochronology and all kinds of archaeological stuff there. So the Vikings spread out, they traveled by sea, they were excellent sailors and navigators, all of these things. And so we often associate Norse culture with the Vikings because, they did things like, sacked Paris and took over Dublin and, ruled England for a while and all of those things. But Norse culture is way bigger than that, way bigger than just Vikings. And also there's the romantic aspect of Viking history, right? We have movies about Vikings, lots of TV shows about Vikings. Marvel Comics has adopted, the Norse pantheon for part of it stuff, Odin and Thor and all of those people. But obviously the Norse culture is much, much bigger, much older than that. Long history, long prehistory, going back to Neolithic times. And so some of what we know, a lot of what we know, there are written records. They wrote down a lot of things. We have, the Eddas, which are, a lot about mythology and beliefs. And we have the sagas that were written down. And those things we understand come from a specific time frame, a specific worldview, all of these things. But we do know a couple of things. And I promise I'm going to get to Norse shamanism in a moment. We do know that shamanism, a form of shamanism, was practiced during Viking times, probably well before that, certainly well after that, to the point where it had to be outlawed by the Christian church. So post-Christianity, it was still practiced. And there are people who still practice today, within, it had been probably hidden within families and that sort of thing. So the Norse practice a lot of magic and a lot of shamanism and a lot of that sort of thing. We have tons and tons of magical books, handwritten magical books of spells and all kinds of things that have been located that, go back, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, there's a term for it. They're called black books. And so there's all kinds of Nordic magic happening there. And so there's a sort of branch, and this is written about in the sagas, it's written about in the Eddas, it's, known. There's this word from Norse, which is Volva, Volva. And I'm using English letters, and I'm mostly using English pronunciation because my mouth doesn't make a lot of the sounds that would be necessary for me to accurately pronounce these things. So you'll forgive me for that. And there are some great, Old Norse linguistic videos on YouTube that you can find. And if you want to hear what we think these things sounded like based on, the way that linguists reconstruct language and sound and that sort of thing. So anyway, there's this word Volva, 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 and that has been sort of loosely translated into the word witch. But it's, witch is one of those words that gets applied to all kinds of spirit workers who are non-Christian, right? And most people who are considered witches by, and burned at the stake or hung or crushed to death under rocks or imprisoned or what have you, were not doing anything of the sort. This was political, financial, sexist, like all of these horrible things, and you can learn about that. But so the word vulva sometimes is translated as witch or seeress, right? Seeress, a woman who sees. And yes, in this case, this title seems to be particularly applied to women. And there are in the Norse world tons of different titles and words for people who work with magic or esoterically or that sort of thing. So there's a descriptive word, troll cunning, which is like troll wise, and troll is not just like troll the creature, but troll is kind of a label that's applied to all kinds of things that are extraordinary, magical. You could say that person is troll. That they're something going on with them. Something magical going on with them. We don't necessarily trust it, but so yeah, people were described as troll cunning, and which again, like in English, in Britain and the UK and those areas, we had people known as cunning people who were essentially spell breakers and herbalists and that sort of thing. But this title vulva implies a specific practice. They were probably doing all sorts of magic and all this stuff, but they were primarily diviners, or at least the way they're written about. They were doing divination, meaning they were seeing into the future, seeing into the past, locating things, and fortune tellers, that sort of thing. And the way they did that was through a ritual practice called Seiðr. And many times in English, that's spelled Seidr. And I know, like, that seems weird that it's spelled that way and pronounced Seiðr. But the reason for that is that the last th character is called an eth, and the eth doesn't exist in English anymore, like it did in Old English when English was essentially German. But it doesn't exist in modern English, but it exists in Old Norse. And in fact, the name Odin is actually Udin, something close to that anyway. I know I'm not probably pronouncing it perfectly. Because that has a Seiðr in it, or has an eth in it rather than a d. But then again, his name became Wotan, and then Woden, and then Odin, and so lots and lots of different ways to pronounce it as languages change, evolve, and form new languages. So these women were practicing Seiðr, which was a form of shamanism, meaning they went into trance. They traveled. They could look, do essentially middle world journeying, and they could talk to spirits, particularly spirits of the dead, spirits of the ancestors. This is shamanism. Whatever else was going on, whether it involved magic or god worship or anything else, this practice is a form of shamanism, or what we would call, what we call shamanism, what academics have agreed shamanism, core shamanism consists of. And so in the, and Seiðr was, I say primarily practiced by women, at least that's the way it's written about. And the sagas also have Odin also practicing Seiðr, but it's implied that in him doing that, he becomes unmanly, that it's not a manly practice. And in fact, it appears that he cross-dresses. He dresses as a woman or takes on the shape of a woman to do this. Now, the Norse myths are full of bisexuality, transsexualism, I guess, for lack of a better term, or at least the gods changing their sex, whether that is dressing as a different gender, or actually taking on the form of somebody in a different gender. Loki takes on the form of a mare, gets impregnated, and gives birth to multiple creatures, including the world serpent and Odin's horse Sleipnir. So, I don't know how controversial this was, how controversial it was to be called unmanly. It seems to have been somewhat of an insult in Viking times, but a lot of what we know comes from writings that happened during the Christian times that look back. So who knows how that was considered back then. And obviously Christianity is a patriarchal system, and at that time created a lot of different rules around what men and women could do. We know in Norse culture, pre-Christian Norse culture, there were definitely roles for men and women. I'm not going to say it was, everything was equal, but it was far more equal than almost any other existing culture. Women could own property, they could hold the money in the family, they could get divorced. You know, these were things that weren't allowed in other cultures of the time, certainly for a really, really long time. You know, and there are female war. Some people say the shield maiden, if you've heard that term, thing is a myth and they didn't actually exist, but there are Viking burials that are women who are buried with arms and armor. So I don't know how else to explain that, and I haven't seen the archaeologists explain that in any different way either. So I don't know that it's just a legend. So women played women played a very important role, a much more important, much more equal role in Old Norse culture than I think anywhere else in Europe, pretty much at that time, particularly Christian Europe. So it's interesting, in one of Snorri Sturluson's sagas, he writes, I believe it's in the saga, there's definitely writing about this, describes Odin as having the ability to shapeshift into different animals. But the way he describes it is that his body lies motionless as if dead. So how is he shapeshifting if his body isn't moving? How is he taking off as an eagle or a bear or a horse or whatever he's shapeshifting into if his body's lying still? My explanation for that, and if you have a different one, that's okay, is that he's doing it in shamanic journey. When shamans shapeshift, I've not witnessed anybody shapeshift their physical body, but we shapeshift our spiritual body. We shapeshift in non-ordinary reality. That is far easier because it's not tied to this physical stuff. This is hard to shapeshift, maybe impossible. I'm not ruling it out, but I haven't witnessed it yet, and I so far have not been able to do that myself. So yeah, Odin is described as doing this practice, which is not named in this part, but going through all of the magic powers that he has, where he can open up the earth and bind everybody. Binding is magical term, and take the treasures of the earth, and he can locate all the treasures of the earth, and he can calm seas, and it's talked about how he sits on graves or underneath men who've been hanged and has conversations with them. So he's talking to spirits. So I think that this is describing shamanic, at least some of it is describing shamanic practice, the shape-shifting, talking to spirits. He has these animal helpers, power animals, maybe. He's got the two ravens, Hugin and Munin, who travel the world and gather information and bring them back to him. Sounds very much like a power animal kind of relationship. And again, I realize I'm imprinting my knowledge of shamanism onto something else, and people do that all the time. But it is specifically written that Odin practiced Seiðr, and sometimes did so dressed as a woman, which I find pretty interesting as well. There is a title for men who practice Seiðr, and that is a Seidr, probably pronouncing it close, but maybe not 100% accurately. Feel free to correct me in the comments. And so, these are men who, who were written about that practice this. So it's unclear about how they were seen in society, because you would think if it was so unmanly that you would be ostracized, that you would be, outside the bounds of protection of the culture, then that would be really dangerous, and hardly anybody would choose to do that, because for survival purposes, you really had to be part of the community. It was hard living back then, hard to survive on your own. So why would people choose to do something that enough that it's been written about, that could potentially see them ostracized? I don't know. I don't have the answer for that. So I don't know how they were really seen in society and how they were dealt with. Indications are that witches and sorcerers and that sort of thing were sort of given a lot of deference and a lot of space. People respected them, but they were also kind of afraid of them, right? Because obviously they could do magic and do things, curse them or bind them or give them boils or kill them or whatever they could do. So they were given a high seat, and they were kind of also outside some of the normal rules. There was an interesting. They have found many Vulva Graves, and a lot of what we know archaeologically about them is from graves throughout Scandinavia. There was a really interesting one in Denmark, and the woman was dug up was wearing a very colorful dress. So apparently the dress had a headband with gold thread on the edge, and had I believe an iron wand. We know that these vulva used staves and wands, and that was an important part of their practice. And was buried on top of a four-wheeled cart, right? So buried with very expensive grave goods, right? Carts were not, it's like burying somebody with a car. So this person in this role was very well respected in this culture, respected enough to be buried in a very expensive and honored way. So the idea that, these people were, outside of normal society, I don't know. I don't know how much water that carries, and maybe it's just the pure fear thing. Hey, if we don't give her a good burial, she's going to come back and haunt us, kind of thing. But it does seem that, they were respected, and we know that King Harold Bluetooth, for example, who we named the Bluetooth from your phone after, we know he traveled around with a vulva, with a seer, and seers were used before battles to try to determine tactics or what might be the outcome, and all of those, things. And so they definitely played an important part, and they definitely. So we know that they were these vulva, we know they were entranced. They were just described as, going into an altered state, traveling, talking to spirits. So we know that at least part of what they were doing, we would consider that shamanic. So, again, this is just a little overview of my perspective on the historicity of Norse shamanism. There are people today who are either recreating Norse shamanism historically, trying to use. It's hard because the practices aren't historically well written down. There are people who create from personal gnosis, which I think is valid in shamanism. Shamanism is all about personal gnosis. So while what you're doing might not be historically accurate, and there may not ever be a way to know, if it works, if it's effective, then it's okay. Just don't pass it off necessarily as something this is traditional. And then there are stories of these practices being passed through family groups, and there are people out there who are now teaching Seiðr and Norse and Nordic magic and shamanism and all kinds of stuff. And I think it's all particularly valid. I have no reason to argue against any of their histories. And again, the real measure of its value is not, to me, is not in its historical accuracy, unless that is really the only thing that's important to you. Its measure is in its effectiveness, right? So, but it's nice. It's nice that we can draw from these cultures, particularly if you feel a connection to this culture. Um, that being said, just a little, I don't know, a little side note on, I have Norse ancestors. I am, my DNA tests say that I'm related to some people from Viking burials, both in Sweden and in the UK. And I'm very interested in Norse culture. I partly identify, and I work with some spirits from that pantheon. Um, it disturbs me and many others who are practicing how Norse symbology and particularly spiritual symbology, has been adopted by racist organizations, by white supremacists in particular. And this happened during the Nazi age as well. The Nazis were trying to gather power from Germanic Nordic roots, and used a lot of imagery and mythology and symbolism. The SS on the SS uniforms are the runes, in the form of the runes of, for Soila, which is the Norse rune for the letter S, and things like that. And so there is a history of horrible racist people co-opting Norse symbology, and that has done a real disservice to the majority of people who study and love and want to use the runes or the Norse pantheon, or the communities like the Asatru communities, who actually are recreating Norse religion. And most of them have signed petitions and rejected white supremacy and racism and all of those things. But it bears mentioning, because these racist groups, are small but loud, and sometimes the loud, obnoxious people are the ones who get the attention, and they don't deserve it. And I will do anything in my power to gather these sacred symbols back from these horrible people. Racism has no place in any spiritual endeavor. It's quite frankly horseshit, all of it. Racism is always horseshit, and it it is ugly, and it is not spiritual, and it is not what the spirits don't care what your race is. If you are from the heart of Africa and you want to worship at the altar of Odin would be grateful and happy to have you. So it doesn't matter where you were born or who your parents are. That's all just BS. And that being said, some people, because of their ancestry, feel a special connection, feel an ancestral connection to particular forms of spirituality. And I think that's fine, as long as it doesn't become exclusionary. And I've seen arguments recently about voodoo, for example. I've seen a lot of people say, hey, voodoo is a closed practice. I kind of hate that term, closed practice. And white people shouldn't practice voodoo. But there are plenty of, African American voodoo practitioners, for example, who are happy to teach white people, and that's even part of their business. And so what you're saying is, let's take away part of the business of these people who don't care and don't see it as a bad thing when people from a different culture come in and want to learn, respect, understand, and take part in their culture. And so I've seen some back and forth about that. It's not my goal to get into a political argument about it, but it's the same thing with any sort of Norse spiritual practice. The white supremacists have tried to ruin a lot of things for a lot of people, and there's just no place for that. So that is sort of a really short overview of my take on Norse shamanism. I continue to learn about it and study it and read about it and learn from people who are teaching it, and all of those kinds of things. I do think it's a cool practice and another link into our past. And and anytime we can link up to ancestors, and it doesn't have to be blood ancestors, we're all related. We all, go back to a single female sometime about 3 million years ago. So we are all cousins, whether you appreciate that or not. But anytime we can find connection to ancestors, I believe there's a whole lot of power there. There's a lot of healing that can come from that. There's so much of that. So with that, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel, first of all, and I hope you're happy and healthy and you stay that way. And I will talk to you real soon.